Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. Ukraine War News Update, second part thereof for the 28th of November 2023. This is possibly going to be, I'm going to see how it goes for time, but possibly only just the military aid and aid segment because there's quite a bit of analysis I want to do, and I'm going to dip into a Justin Bronk-Ward-Carroll video, which I think is really useful to listen to. So I may leave the geopolitics video for a separate one. Anyway, let's start with the US. The amount of presidential drawdown authority that President Biden has requested in his package to Congress is very low for Ukraine. He requested $7 billion to be the presidential drawdown authority cap in 2024. US sent that in 3 months of this year. So although we've seen a massive reduction over the last few months due to Congress not being able to agree on anything, and we'll talk about that in a second. In fact, we'll probably talk about that now. Congress needs to raise this or it won't be good for Ukraine. It's a 50% decrease in direct military aid to Ukraine that will not lead them to success on the battlefield, and that is so super important. Now, there's, oh goodness me, there's so much to talk about with regard to American politics. This is what Mike Johnson, you know I'm no big fan of his, but this is what the Speaker of the House of US Representatives has said, and I don't know, I do wonder whether there are going to be people who are briefing some of these key decision makers in private, like Department of Defense people, intelligence people going, right, okay, you're concerned with what you do in your state over there, and you're a congressman, so you work on a 2-year basis. You're not so interested and knowledgeable about international relations, about the geopolitical status of the globe, right? You're worried about getting re-elected in 2 years' time, so you want to say and do things that are going to really please your base around where you're working. So there's a real difference, like I said before, between the 2-year cycle of Congress people and a 6-year cycle of senators. And there are only 100 senators, and they're generally a bit older and a bit more wizened, right? And so those are the people. And is it therefore a surprise that you appear to have more bipartisan support between the Republicans and Democrats in the Senate than you do in the House? So I wonder whether in this intervening period of Johnson putting a bit of a kibosh on the bills passing through the House of Representatives, whether people have gone to him and said, by the way, we just need to tell you about how freaking important this is and what the ramifications of not doing this will be for A, the world, B, for the United States, right? Just to let you know that it's not just a political football to be used to try and get a bit more funding for the border, or so that you can sort of grandstand your culture wars issues that you have. Okay, this is really freaking important. And I don't know whether someone said that, because he's come out and said this, but I don't know whether this is part of his own politicking, right? So I just don't know. But anyway, this is potentially good news, but it's coming a little bit late.
Ukraine is another priority. Of course, we can't allow Vladimir Putin to march through Europe, and we understand the necessity of assisting there. What we've said is that if there is to be additional assistance to Ukraine, which most members of Congress believe is important, we have to also work in changing our own border policy. And so there's been a lot of thoughtful negotiation ongoing with that. I think most of our Senate colleagues recognize that those two things need to move together because we owe that to the American people. That's what they're demanding that we do. Ukraine is another priority. Of course, we can't allow Vladimir Putin to march through Europe, and we understand.
So that first part is definitely really good to hear from him. Very explicit, but then obviously he couches it in the, but I'm still going to be arguing for this border funding. So this is still this political football that is being used to play this game of leveraging funding in different areas. But I hope that he is in a position now where he's more knowledgeable, because he was new into the position of speaker. And I don't know whether that now gets him the ability to be like briefed, or the necessity to be briefed more fully on international matters. I just don't know, but I would hope so. It is a real challenge, and it's a challenge because Putin is militarizing the Russian economy. I said this in my previous video. I gave a bit of a hint about this, but they are getting on a war footing, and they've done that a bit surreptitiously. And it is a real worry, because when you get on a war footing, you are able to actually you can sustain your economy quite successfully. It becomes a very narrow economy, and it won't be one maybe the elites like, because they can't go out and buy Prada and this and that. It's more about, lubricating the economy in other ways that pertains solely to the prosecution of a war. So Putin is militarizing the Russian economy, using high oil revenues to pay for growing weapons production. Meanwhile, political paralysis in the US and Europe threatens the supply of weapons and money on which Ukraine depends for survival. So let's just dip into this Wall Street Journal article. Okay, so I hope you don't mind me doing this little bit of analysis, because I think it's really bloody important. Okay, so the Wall Street Journal is onto this. Putin has staked Russia's resources on victory in Ukraine. Can the West match him? And this is the question. Are we doing enough to match what Russia is doing? Russia is not doing well in this war. They are tanking effectively in terms of successes on the battlefield, in terms of the ratio of lost equipment and personnel to the Ukrainians, but they have much greater resources than Ukraine itself on its own has, in terms of personnel and in terms of equipment up until now. And so now, with the exhaustion almost of the stockpiled equipment Russia has, it is getting onto a war footing to produce replacement equipment. What are we doing in terms of supporting Ukraine? So the quote from this Wall Street Journal article: the material advantages in 2024 are principally on Russia's side, but they don't appear decisive enough that Russia will be able to achieve its political aims, said Michael Kaufman, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a Washington, D.C. based think tank. It's inaccurate to suggest that Russia is winning the war, he said. However, if the right choices are not made next year on Ukraine's approach and Western resourcing, then Ukraine's prospects for success look dim. The US, European Union and UK have a combined annual economic output of about $45 trillion, 20 times the size of Russia's economy. So basically, the entity with the biggest economy wins a war. Ukraine on paper has the biggest economy because it has NATO and the EU behind it, right? But only as long as NATO and the EU and allied nations remain staunchly committed to Ukraine in terms of their economies. Otherwise, Russia wins in terms of the economy, especially if it can have clandestine access to China and BRICS, etc., etc. So the US, European Union and UK have a superior technology as well. On paper, Ukraine's backers are much stronger than its attacker, but Russia is making far more effort. The Russian's government budget plan for 24 to 26, approved earlier this month, shows the country devoting an even larger share of resources to the war. Military spending is set to rise to more than $100 billion next year, the highest level since Soviet times. Factories are switching production from civilian goods to tanks and drones. Civilian sectors are paying the price, with shortages of capacity and workers pushing up inflation. But the stimulus from massive military spending is propping up the Russian economy, offsetting the effect of Western sanctions. This is the importance of moving to a war footing, is that they can offset issues that they otherwise would have, and they can also control any kind of protest or dissidence they might get within the economy or within society due to having incredibly wide-ranging, huge quantities of internal security services and the FSB and so on and so forth. So they won't have too much of a problem doing this. Yeah, the elites won't be happy, but this is now an existential issue for Russia, more so than it was, and particularly for Putin, as I've argued before. Now, as it continues, Moscow is using trade with third countries to import the sanctioned Western technologies that its arms producers need. It has also found a way to circumvent the West's price cap on its oil exports by building up its own fleet of oil tankers that aren't subject to Western regulations. Mass production has allowed Russia to catch up with Ukraine in making small battlefield drones, an area where Ukrainian innovation previously gave it an edge. This is one of the big worries I'm having at the moment, moment is that asymmetry is being minimized, so that there is now a kind of parity, and perhaps Russia might even overtake Ukraine in terms of production of drones. But where Ukraine's reliance on small workshops and volunteers is showing its limits. The West has implemented only limited steps to boost military production. The US is increasing its output of artillery shells. The EU countries are failing to coordinate it to place orders and motivate investment in new defence production. The EU promised Ukraine 1 million artillery shells by next March, but officials say the bloc will fall far short. In contrast, North Korea provided Russia with 1 million shells in a short time this autumn, according to South Korean intelligence. European countries are running out of stockpiled arms and ammunition they can give Ukraine. Political divisions in Washington have already slowed US deliveries. Shells from South Korea helped Ukrainian artillery to achieve parity with Russian forces for part of this year. Now Ukrainian troops say they are at a disadvantage again. And it goes on to talk about how issues in the US political landscape with regards to what is going on in Congress with Mike Johnson, so on and so forth. Those divisions are causing political confusion and a bit of a stalemate and is not helping Ukraine. Likewise, in the EU, countries like Hungary and Slovakia are causing a similar issue with regard to the EU's unity and continued support. It goes. I mean, there's so much to say from this article. A generation of EU politicians who for years underestimated Putin's challenge to the continent's post-Cold War is struggling to adapt to the return of large-scale war between European states. Quote, I fear that we have not yet taken the measure of the adversary. It is not that strategic, not that intelligent, but it is very, very determined, said Constanze Stelzenmüller, a director of the Brookings Institution in Washington. So much more to say about that. Okay, let's go to Richard Barrons, who is he's now retired. What was he? Brigadier, head of Joint Forces UK, involved in NATO, so on and so forth. Just given a really it's a wide-ranging talk, this. It's only half an hour. Go and listen to it. Really good chat. Or just presentation he gives to the Lucerne Dialogue, which is a group of European business, science, politics, societal people. Like, these are the movers and shakers he's given this talk to, and at one point in this talk he absolutely nails it. And here it is. Just going to make sure I've got it on normal speed. No, playback speed of 1.75. Let's go to normal. Right.
So let's circle back round. So the war in Ukraine is about your interests and your security. And let's come down to the issue of the day here, where you get to make a choice. And that is, right now, there are Ukrainian soldiers sitting in trenches, and they'll be there all winter, with not enough ammunition or equipment or training.
And this is where it gets a bit arsey, and rightly so.
There's nothing on their shelf. There's nothing left on our shelves. We've given all the stuff that we kept in store. The only way Ukraine wins is if we now mobilize our industry and our will behind that. And do not tell me it's unaffordable, because you represent an economy of 15 trillion euros a year, and I can feed the Ukrainian military on about 75 billion euros a year for 2 or 3 years, and I can make them win. This is not about affordability. This is about choice and competence.
And he goes on to talk, in great depth about this, and previously to what he said. It's really worth listening to.
If we can defeat Russia's objections to you on a war in Ukraine where you only spend money, you do not spend your children. Bargain of the century. And then
well worth watching, as I keep saying. So then we're going to go to Justin Bronk, who talks specifically about shells here, but then talks a lot about those larger ideas that Richard Barrons is talking to in much of his speech. But listen to Justin Bronk from the Royal United Services Institute, who is an expert in many things military, particularly Air Force.
And the danger is that as we go through the winter.
By the way, and he's just talked about how the ramping up of shell production is kind of not enough. The EU has to get like unanimity, so it's not quite quick enough, and it's not really urgent enough. I think the whole world, all of the allies that are supporting Ukraine are just not being urgent enough. You look at the US with what's just happened over the last month, really. It's not urgent enough. This needs to happen. It needs to happen now. EU, and especially with the issues with Hungary and Slovakia.
Because the supply of shells is likely to get less, because it's difficult to sustain the rate that we've been supplying at. If the Ukrainians are firing fewer shells, and 80% of the casualties are caused by artillery, then the Russian casualty rate will drop. And if you strip all the morality and all the other nuance out of it, the basic equation on how this goes next year is, can the Ukrainians keep killing and maiming enough Russians to mean that most people who are mobilized in each 6-month round of conscription have to be fed directly into the front lines with limited training in order to fill the gaps? And as long as that keeps happening, which it has done for the last year and a bit, it's very difficult for the Russians to regenerate large-scale offensive formation.
Such an important point. So if the Russians want to bring high-quality forces to bear in Ukraine, they need to conscript enough people, train them, and equip them adequately, and then send them in. So it takes a year, really, before you're going to start wanting to put those people on the front line. What's the situation actually been? Well, they've been throwing people that have been conscripted or mobilized, only for a couple of weeks, throwing them straight into the front line. And they're having to do that because of the attrition of personnel due to primarily the Ukrainian artillery. Okay, and we can talk about drones replacing artillery to some degree, but you get the point. That artillery, it being the god of war, is responsible for Russia bringing to the front lines unprepared soldiers and poorly equipped soldiers. Now, if that attrition rate drops because shell provision drops, then the Russians will be able to train their forces better, will be able to prepare them better, will be able to mobilize them more effectively. It becomes just a slower process for them. They're not having to feed everyone into the meat grinder straight away. And that will have a much more positive effect on Russia.
So to do defensive warfare, you just need bodies in trenches, pretty much. To do offensive warfare, you need large formed units at brigade scale, at least, that can maneuver with armor and electronic warfare and UAV support and infantry and armor personnel carriers and all of this stuff and logistics. And it takes time to train both soldiers to operate like that and staffs to run them. The Ukrainians are finding it difficult to train people to operate at that scale, partly because their training areas are within range of missile strikes. And the Russians are finding it hard because the casualty rate is so high that they're having to just feed people in too quickly. So if the Ukrainians can keep the casualty rate high, then they can probably retain the initiative through into spring, and then it's easier to keep up the political case for continuing to supply them. Yes, it's a grind, but it's the right thing to do, and it is in our own security interests, so we'll keep doing it. If they're not, and the Russians are able to essentially seize the initiative going into the spring because we didn't put the right industrial investments in place now to allow us to dig deeper in our own stocks to keep them supplied, because the Russians can't pose a direct threat to us in Europe as long as they're pinned down in Ukraine. So if we have made those investments and we know that in 18 months to 2 years, we're going to get X number of shells coming through to replenish our own stocks, we know we've got resupply, therefore we can dig deeper into our stockpiles. If we don't know that resupply, where it's coming from or when, then it's much harder to dig any deeper. And so if those decisions aren't made, now the Russians get the initiative, at which point, then there's a much more difficult trade-off for European countries in particular, because then the trade-off is not, the discussion is not how do we keep Ukraine supplied sufficiently to continue its war successfully. The discussion becomes instead, can we give the Ukrainians enough to stabilize things, or do we have to prioritize refilling our own depleted stockpiles because all of a sudden we feel very vulnerable ourselves? Where things go is really up to European countries this winter. if we continue to look at this as a short-term, month-to-month thing, then I worry the investments aren't going to be made right. And so
This is an absolute. There is an absolute necessity to see this as a big long-term thing. There are elements of that kind of thought process going on. You've got lots of countries and the EU in part saying we're going to put things in place to 2027 and beyond, a 5-year plan for you. But there's also this idea that it's kind of very reactive. No, we need to sit down and go, right, do we really want this thing to end well for us and for us, for Ukraine initially, and that ends well for us? Well, then it's in our best interest to get onto our own kind of war footing and say, right, we need to put our money where our kind of, not even where our mouths are. Well, yeah, it is. We're in this for as long as it takes. Okay, well, how about first of all saying we're in this to have you win as soon as possible and as efficiently as possible and as effectively as possible? Okay, well, in that case, we need to put our money where our mouth has just been, and then sort out the production that's going to facilitate that end goal.
The key messages I would say, from a political perspective, politicians need to understand that this is going to run long, and if they don't keep up the supply, then it's going to run long, but in a much more dangerous way that will ultimately require us to spend far more money defending ourselves against a much more dangerous Russian posture, an emboldened one at that. But therefore, since it's going to run long, A, the investments just need to be made in production, not trying to buy stuff elsewhere. And B, make the case to the politicians need to make the case to their voters to say, this is not money that's being sent overseas. This is money that we're proposing to spend at scale on massive development of industrial skilled factory jobs, often in really deprived areas of our own countries, because that's generally where munitions factories are, is in really deprived areas. So, given how much nations borrow, tens of billions when it suits them, to pump into economic stimulus packages, whether it be COVID recovery or leveling up agendas or whatever it happens to be, use the same logic, use the same sources of funding to pump money into production in our own countries. Because apart from anything else, the countries that do that, the world is looking pretty dangerous for the next 3 to 5 years at least. China threat isn't going away. It's accelerating faster than we hoped or feared. You look at the latest congressional report on the Chinese military modernization. It's just bad news on bad news.
I saw a video yesterday of Chinese workers leaving a port where they're making massive ships, right? And it was like knocking off time. It was like literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of workers all knocked off at once, and they're all on mopeds and bicycles, and it was a sea of mopeds and bicycles leaving these massive half-built ships. They are building ships insanely quickly at the moment, the Chinese, and they are up. They're kind of upgrading their entire armed forces, but the Navy, there's some big old bits of kit being built.
In terms of this is ahead of schedule, this is bigger than we thought, this is ahead of schedule. So the US is going to be tied up in the Indo-Pacific for the foreseeable, which means Europe isn't going to be reinforced at scale if something happens concurrently with a crisis in the Indo-Pacific in Europe with the Russians, which means the Russians have an incentive to do something if there's a crisis in the Indo-Pacific. And the Russians are on a war economy footing now. They were at a low point at the beginning of this year, but they've turned a corner, unfortunately. Missile production is massively up. Artillery production is massively up. They're producing nearly twice what they produced last year this year. They're spending a load of money, about 4.5% of their GDP on defense at the moment. And they just approved a spending increase of 68% on this year's figures for next year. They've got ammunition supply set up, new manufacturing capacity set up for them in North Korea, in Iran, in a couple of the stans. So they've also diversified supply. The Russians are kind of gearing up for a long, grinding war. And so the other thing is, if we don't invest in making our, not just Ukrainian consumption rates sustainable to enable Ukraine to keep grinding forward and potentially win, but also to refill our own stocks, The danger is we get to a point in 2 to 3 years' time with the US tied up in the Indo-Pacific where Europe suddenly has very little. And at that point, you would have a rearmed Russia, a very embittered Russia, a very battle-hardened Russia, and suddenly a very vulnerable Europe. And so, without wanting to sound too alarmist, too much of the defense discussion in Europe and in the UK is treated politically and in public as a sort of inconvenient distraction. Yeah, of course, well, we kind of have to keep supporting the Ukrainians because it's the right thing to do, but it's all very expensive. And how long can we keep this up? And it's difficult. And but there's a lot of other things, there's health and, but the NHS is falling apart and all this stuff. And it's like, yeah, it is inconvenient. It is expensive. It is difficult. But sadly, the enemy's made that decision for you. It isn't a game. And
such an important point. So this isn't our choice. It's like, yeah, you can feel like, oh, we could choose to spend it on healthcare, or we can choose to spend that money, or we can maybe dip into reserves and do both. But there's not. We have to do this, and it's not a kind of choice. It's being forced upon us by other people, as in Putin and Russia. And if we frame it in that way, then it's like, you don't have to sell it as oh, should we do this or that? It's like, we are doing this, and do you know who you need to blame? It's not us. It's not your politicians in your own country. It's that Egypt over there in the Kremlin. That's who you want to blame. So if you want to get angry, go and write him a letter. Yeah, but we need to make these decisions, and that has been thrust upon us.
I would much rather be accused of being a bit overzealous in pointing out the very obvious trend signal of threat now, and get to a position in 2 to 3 years' time where, if nothing happens, people go, see, you were way too concerned about that, than the alternative, which is people continuing to treat it as an optional, difficult, short-term thing that we just manage rather than plan against, and suddenly coming in a year and a half or 2 years' time and going, oh God, this is actually a real problem. And all our solutions are still 3 years away if we pull the lever now, because it takes 2 to 3 years to do anything in defense.
Yeah, I mean, history.
So much more from that video that's worth talking about, particularly in terms of planes. They need to get Gripens there. Gripens are arguably better than F-16s, actually, in some of the ways that he talks about there in terms of the training for 2s and 4s needed to fly F-16s as opposed to Gripens. So just a really amazing interview. But it's scary, and it's made me realise again how bloody important this is and how much we need to get behind supporting the Ukraine. And it will come at huge costs to us as countries and societies. But if that doesn't happen, then it might not happen. It might not affect your life in the next 2 or 3 years, but your children or our countries going forward over the next 10 years, over the next 20 years, where you have China chomping at the bit and looking to Ukraine to see what they can learn. If we're not robust now, like this is changing the world's geopolitical landscape, not for the benefit of Europe and America, that's for sure, and very much for the benefit of Russia and China. Anyway, to move on to, the more usual kind of things I talk about in this segment, which is military equipment and aid. Rebar, the pro-Russian source, saying in the French ports of Saint-Nazaire, 4 FPB-98 patrol boats were loaded aboard a transport vessel, Fusion. Under the contract from 2019, the French had to deliver 20 of these boats. The previous deliveries were carried out according to the same scheme in the Romanian port of Constanta and then overland to the port of Ismail, where FPB-98 are still located. It is highly probable that this time the route will be similar. Currently, the Fusion is heading south of Spain after passing through the Strait of Gibraltar. The whole journey will take another week or so. It's interesting, the Montreux Convention and the closing of Bosphorus Straits to naval vessels. Can you load up naval vessels on a cargo ship and take them to Romania and then offload them in Romania and take them overland to Ukraine. That's interesting. Anyway, that's what Rebar says. France are delivering those. Interesting. Okay, one more armoured ambulance has arrived in Ukraine. Vehicle meets NATO ballistic standards, protects from artillery, shrapnel, bullets, etc. 13 such cars are purchased with the help of the United 24, so that's Army of Drones kind of stuff, donors, and now on will evacuate wounded from the front line, thanks to everyone who supports. I mean, fantastic. That looks like a pretty robust ambulance to me. And talking about these kind of vehicles, Ukrainian forces from the 808th Separate Support Regiment have set up a domestic operation customizing US-supplied Humvees for various engineering units. Seen here, significantly up-armored and modified M1152 Humvee. So they are taking US-provided equipment and then upgrading them and specializing them for the needs that they have. So that's pretty cool. Right, Ukraine to change conscription policies to drive to sustain fighting capacity. This is a real worry. It has been a worry for a long time for Ukraine, which is where they're going to sustainably keep getting their boots on the ground from. We've heard that Zelensky has issued a demand to get a plan up and running over the next week from Zaluzhny and other military minds. In fact, one of Zelensky's party's MPs has got in trouble yesterday for calling out Zaluzhny and asking Zaluzhny to resign because there's nothing in place in this kind of context. Things think this is an issue for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainian government is planning to change its conscription practices as it seeks to sustain fighting capacity after nearly 2 years of full-fledged war with Russia. The changes expected to be announced this week will include the use of commercial recruitment companies to carry out more targeted conscription and to reassure conscripts they will be deployed in roles that match their skills and not simply sent to the front, according to one senior official. It's that trade-off, like we really need boots on the ground, and we really need troops at the front, but actually people are going to be afraid to do that. We don't want them running away and escaping to another country, as we saw in Russia. So how do we cope with that? Quote, some people are scared to die, scared to shoot, but it doesn't mean that they can't be involved in other activities. Now that we have a minister with a new approach, Alexei Danilov, Secretary of Ukraine's Security Council, told The Guardian. In early September, the President Zelensky sacked Reznikov, who had been defense minister since the beginning of the war, and replaced him with Umarov, who spent the early part of the war working on doomed negotiations with Russia. On Friday, Zelensky said he expected Umarov's ministry to provide him with a package of new mobilization policies this week. Zelensky told a news conference, the plan will be worked out and all answers will be there. Next week, I will see this plan. So we'll have to wait to see what the details might be on that, but I think that is going to be incredibly significant. When you talk about drone capacities, literally capacity, I mean, how many IEDs can they hold, and actually how they work in dropping these. I've talked to you about this before, that, that's an interesting way that it's got a lever working there. Well, this is a pretty interesting way of dropping drones. Has a rotating mechanism there. So anyway, that gives you an idea of how that thing can drop 5 grenades and wreak havoc on Russian troops. Ukrainigo will receive 24.5 million euros from Germany to strengthen Ukraine's power system. So this is the National Energy Company. This was announced by the chairman of the board of Ukrainigo. Well, I wonder if I assume that's part of a larger package, because we get the report here that Germany has allocated more money for the repair and modernization of the Ukrainian energy system to the tune of 300 million euros. So I guess that's some of it going directly to Ukrainigo and the rest of it going to other projects to get the energy infrastructure repaired and upgraded. So moving on to Russian military situation and aid and procurement. Ramzan Kadyrov, the Chechen warlord, is intending to send 3,000 more fighters to Ukraine. Let's hope they are just TikTok warriors. They have the best equipment and modern weapons. In addition, the guys are very combative and motivated to achieve results, he said on his Telegram channel, of course. According to Kadyrov, the fighters have already begun service in the new units of the Russian Defense Ministry and Rosgvardia, and that they have been trained by instructors in the Special Forces University. In May, he claimed that he had sent more than 26,000 fighters to Ukraine. The Ukrainian military found a Chinese-made 60mm Type 83 M83A mortar bomb on Russian positions in the Melitopol region. There are 5 gas check rings below the Burelet and a light alloy tail fin assembly with 10 fixed stabilizing fins fitted. So this is just, giving you evidence of this being a Chinese mortar bomb. I guess the question therefore is, where did it come from? How did it get there? This requires an immediate and clear reaction from the Ukrainian armed forces, both in communication with China and with the Western partners. Otherwise, a lack of reaction from the UAE, EU and NATO partners would encourage China to A, increase the volume of supplies, and B, expand the range of supplies. This is absolutely true. If this has crept in and nothing's done about this, then they'll just do more of it and expand that. And they get more stuff and a wider variety of stuff. There needs to be an investigation into that, and this needs to be kind of blown up to be a big, big thing. Right, Putin's daughter's foundation has become a co-owner of Russia's largest drone manufacturer. So not only are they getting onto a war footing, but Putin's own family is nepotistically getting into the production of these pieces of equipment. So the National Intellectual Development NID Fund, headed by Vladimir Putin's daughter, Katerina Tikhonova, has bought a stake in Geoscan, Russia's largest drone manufacturer. Interesting how his daughter is effectively a billionaire by doing what? Oh yeah, being the daughter of Putin, who's stolen gazillions of spondoolies off his own country. Anyway, Geoscan Group produces civilian aviation drones as well as software for photogrammetric data processing. Ukraine imposed sanctions on Geoscan in early July 2023, explaining that the company's products are integrated into the chain of production of military and/or dual-use goods and services. Well, this appears to be incredibly true. The reason for Kiev's sanctions was a statement by Bashkiria's head of government, Andrei Nazarov, who announced the creation of drones for the war in Ukraine at Geoscan UFA's facility. So when they announced, we're making drones for the war, like Ukraine and go, we're going to sanction that company for making drones for the war. Yeah. Anton Gerashchenko, words. Russia says Russia has failed at the largest air show in the Middle East. Russian arms exporter didn't report signing any deals at the event. I've talked about this previously, how the second biggest arms exporter in the world will no longer be that. I can't see them being in the top 10. I'd love to see actual stats for the last year in terms of doing deals and sales, because they can't afford, in terms of the amount of stuff, they can't afford to export arms to other countries because they need all that arms themselves. And so they'll be dropping down the list surely very quickly. You hear reports of using export tanks, Indian export tanks on the front line rather than upgrading them and sending them back to India, as was reported earlier in the war, so on and so forth. Largest aerospace exhibition in the Middle East, Dubai Air Show 2023, which brought together leading manufacturers of civil and military aircraft, seems to have ended in a fiasco for Rosoboron Export. Following the November event, Russian state corporation and member of the Rostec holding company and a monopolist in the supply of Russian arms for export did not report the signing of a single contract. At the previous Dubai 2021 salon, they reported deals worth $1.3 billion, and in 2017, it boasted contracts worth $10 billion. At Russia's last arms show, Army 2023, the company agreed on sales worth $600 million, while a year earlier, at a similar event, $390 million. The head of Rosoboron Export, Alexander Mikheev, urged potential foreign customers on the first day of the salon not to be afraid of sanctions against the state corporation, which have blocked it from dollar payments since 2018, but neither the buyers nor the organizers of the exhibition were convinced. The Russian exposition in Dubai was evicted to the back of the exhibition space, away from global industry leaders such as Lockheed Martin, Boeing and Airbus, which, according to Reuters, managed to sign contracts worth $67 billion. This is incredibly important for Ukraine and actually for the US. To be perfectly honest, what you don't want is Russia making money from selling arms around the world, and also having the influence, that geopolitical, that militarily strategic influence of having their kit all around the world. The US obviously laughing all the way to the bank here and all the way to this geopolitical bank, because Russia are being shunned by the rest of the world in terms of their military equipment, and that means that they are less able to fund further development of equipment and less able to fund the war. So this has many different ramifications. Right. However, Iran has finalized a deal with Russia on the purchase of Sukhoi 35 fighters, military Mi-28 attack helicopters, and Mi-28 attack helicopters, and Yakovlev Yak 130 training aircraft. Iranian Deputy Defense Minister Sardar Fahi told Tasnim agency, according to the official, these assets were already transported to Iran. So it could have already happened, but there's a deal involving, no doubt, Shaheeds going the other way, ballistic missiles possibly, cruise missiles. That's a real worry. However, I'll be interested to know how many of these helicopters Russia can spare to be able to export to Iran, and exactly when it was, and whether that includes future airframes going that way, and how they will be able to fulfill those orders. Anyway, that's the end of this military aid segment. It is more of an analysis. It's hugely important. It really is. And I'm going to dip more into that Justin Bronk video as I go forward over the next couple of days, because it is that good. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe and share, and get on and pressure your politicians to do the right thing. Take care. Speak soon.